My name is Celeste Oram. I'm 33 years old. And the evening my aunt stood up at my cousin's wedding reception and told a seated room of 87 people that my catering business would collapse inside a year was the evening I understood that a public prediction carries its own accountability, not in the moment it's made, but in the distance between the moment it's made and the moment the evidence arrives. She did not stand to give a toast. That was the particular quality of what she did. It arrived not as a formal address, but as a comment inserted into the ambient noise of the reception, at a volume calibrated for the table nearest to her, which happened to be the table where 14 of my mother's closest family friends were seated. My Aunt Vera had a quality that I recognized from years of watching her operate at family events. She spoke at the volume of someone making a point, not the volume of someone having a conversation. The point reached further than the conversation would have. She left accounting to sell food out of her kitchen, she said, to the table and to everyone within 8 feet of it. Give it a year. The laugh that moved through that section of the room was not a laugh of cruelty. It was the laugh of people who recognized a familiar story, the one where someone sensible does something impractical and the outcome is already written. My mother, 2 tables away, caught my eye and mouthed the word sorry with the particular expression of a woman who had tried to stop something and arrived a half-second too late. My cousin Danny, whose wedding it was on the dance floor and had not heard. His new wife, Priya, glanced at me from across the room and then looked away. I reached for the water glass in front of me. I refilled it from the pitcher at the center of the table. I set the pitcher back down, smoothed the napkin across my lap, and turned to the woman beside me, a neighbor of my grandmother's named Elsie Ford, who was 81 and had been talking earlier about her herb garden, and asked her whether the rosemary came back reliably in this region or whether she replanted it each spring. Elsie told me about the rosemary for 6 minutes. I was entirely present for it. I drove home at 11:15, took off my shoes at the door, and stood in my kitchen for a while with the lights on low and the quiet of a Friday night settling around me. What no one at that wedding knew, what I had not mentioned to my aunt or my mother or my cousin Danny or anyone in that room, was that 4 days earlier I had taken a call from a production assistant at a primetime food and lifestyle program called The Table, hosted by a chef named Marcus Vale, who had asked whether I would be available to discuss a potential feature segment in their spring season. I had said I was available. I had not said anything else to anyone. Let me go back to the beginning because the beginning is where the accounting comment came from, and the beginning is the only place the rest of this makes sense. I had worked for 7 years as a senior accountant at a regional manufacturing firm called Dunlap and Crane. I was good at the work. I understood financial systems, cost modeling, the logic of where money moved inside a complex operation, and why it moved the way it did. I had passed my CPA examination on the first attempt, which was not nothing, and I had been promoted to senior level at year 4, which was a year ahead of the typical trajectory at Dunlap and Crane. My direct manager, a measured and fair-minded man named Gerald Petch, told me at my year 5 review that I was tracking toward a manager role and that he expected to be having that conversation within 2 years. I had also been cooking seriously since I was 19, not as a hobby in the way that hobbies fill time. As a discipline, I had learned to cook in the way I had learned accounting, by understanding the underlying structure of it, by reading not just recipes but the reasons behind techniques, by caring about the gap between something that was adequate and something that was correct. My grandmother on my mother's side had been the original teacher, a woman named Odette Oram who had been cooking for crowds since before I was born and who had a specific quality of attention in the kitchen that I had absorbed without fully understanding what I was absorbing until years later. She cooked the way structural engineers think about load, everything placed for a reason, nothing decorative that was not also functional, the whole thing assembled so that it would hold under pressure. She passed when I was 24. I was already at Dunlap and Crane by then, and the 2 years after she died were the years I cooked the most seriously, which was not grief exactly but was adjacent to it, a way of being in proximity to something she had taught me. I started catering in the margins of the Dunlap and Crane years because a coworker named Bet Ferris asked me to provide food for her daughter's graduation party, and the party had 40 guests, and I organized it the way I organized anything: a production schedule, a cost model, a timeline with buffer built in. The food was right. 3 of the 40 guests asked Bet, who had catered. 2 of them became clients. By my 6th year at Dunlap and Crane, I was running 6 to 8 catering events per year on weekends and evenings, grossing approximately $38,000 annually outside my salary, with a client list that had grown almost entirely through referral. I had not advertised. I had not built a website. I had answered the phone when someone called and delivered what I said I would deliver, on time and at the quality I had described, and the referrals had followed from that with the logic of things that work. The decision to leave Dunlap and Crane was not impulsive. It was modeled. I spent 4 months building a financial projection that accounted for the transition period, the overhead of moving from a residential kitchen to a commercial license facility, the client volume I would need to sustain the operation at various revenue levels, and the runway I had in savings if the first year underperformed. I had $91,000 in savings. I needed 8 months of runway, at minimum. The projection said the business could be self-sustaining within 14 months if I maintained the referral conversion rate I had established and added 2 to 3 new anchor clients in the first 6 months. I gave notice on a Thursday. Gerald Petch received it with the professionalism I expected from him and asked twice whether I was certain. I said yes both times. He said the door was open and he meant it, and I believed him, and I left anyway. I did not tell my family before I gave notice. My mother knew I had been catering. She did not know the numbers, and she did not know how long I had been planning the exit. I told her the Saturday after I gave notice, over coffee at her kitchen table. She said, "When?" I said, 3 weeks. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Okay," and I could hear in the single syllable the entirety of her response, the concern, the effort to contain the concern, the decision to let me have the thing I had decided. My Aunt Vera found out at a family gathering 6 weeks later. I was not in the room when she found out. I was in the kitchen helping with plates when I heard her say, in her carrying voice, she left a CPA position to do catering? Someone should talk to her. My mother apparently responded with something quiet that ended the conversation, but the conversation had already completed its work. The wedding was 8 months after I left Dunlap and Crane. I registered the business as Orem Catering in the month I left the firm. My first act as a registered business was to lease time at a commercial kitchen facility called the Meridian Kitchen Collective, a shared space managed by a coordinator named Theo Bassett who had been running the facility for 11 years and who knew every food safety regulation in the state with the confidence of someone who had been inspected many times and had never had a problem. Theo's informal intake process for new tenants was a 15-minute conversation in which he asked 3 questions. What were you doing before this? What is your production volume? And what is your error rate? I told him I had been a CPA, that my production volume was currently 8 to 12 events per year, and that my error rate on food delivery was 0 across 6 years and roughly 64 events. He said, "What's your definition of error?" I said, "Food that was wrong in temperature, quantity, or quality when it arrived at the client. 0 instances." He said, "I'll get you the paperwork." The Meridian Kitchen Collective gave me the licensed production space and the health department certification that a residential kitchen couldn't provide. It also gave me proximity to other food producers, a Vietnamese dumpling operation run by a woman named Nguyen, a specialty cake studio run by a man named Patrick Osei, a fermentation and pickle operation whose owner I knew only as Joe, and the informal knowledge exchange that comes from being in proximity to people who are doing adjacent things at similar scales. And Nguyen referred me my first anchor client as a full-time caterer, a corporate event manager named Sandra Vick, who handled in-office catering for a cluster of professional services firms in the downtown corridor. Sandra was organized and demanding and had been burned by 2 catering operations in the previous 18 months, one that had arrived late, one that had delivered the wrong food. She told me this on our first call and said that she needed someone who understood that her reputation was downstream of my performance. I said I understood that exactly. Sandra and I worked out a quarterly retainer arrangement, 12 events per quarter at a base rate of $4,200 per event, with a variable add-on for events over 50 guests. She paid net 15, which was faster than the industry standard, because she said slow payment created operational problems for small vendors, and she did not want operational problems in her vendor relationships. I noted this, and it informed how I thought about my own payment terms going forward. The Sandra Vick retainer, was the financial backbone of year one. Around it, I built a portfolio of private events, dinner parties, anniversary celebrations, a series of quarterly board dinners for a nonprofit cultural organization whose executive director, a woman named Roberta Chin, had been referred to me by Patrick Osei. Roberta was precise about dietary requirements and flexible about everything else, which was the ideal client configuration. I did 6 events for the organization in the first year and 5 in the second. Year 1 revenue for Orem Catering, $287,000. I paid myself $64,000, which was less than I had earned at Dunlap and Crane, and reinvested the remainder in equipment, a part-time prep assistant named Marco Delgado, and a bookkeeping service run by an accountant named Yolanda Fitch, who I had met through the Meridian Kitchen Collective's informal tenant network and who I trusted with my numbers because she asked better questions than I expected. Year 1 ended 3 weeks before my cousin Danny's wedding. The wedding was a Saturday in October. I was a guest, not the caterer. The catering had been handled by a larger operation than mine, a firm with a full-time event staff and a fleet of vehicles. I sat at table 11 and I watched the catering operation work, and I noted 3 things it did well and 2 things I would have done differently, and then Elsie Ford told me about her Rosemary. The production assistant from the table was named Cora Wills. We spoke for 22 minutes on that Tuesday call. She explained the segment format. The program featured working food professionals, chefs, producers, caterers, bakers, in their operational environment, with a host Marcus Vail joining them for a portion of the episode. The segment was not a competition format. It was a profile. The angle for my segment, as Cora described it, was the transition from financial professional to food professional, and the specific question of what accounting training gave you as a foundation for running a food business. I said that was a question I had a lot of material on. She said they'd been referred to me by Sandra Vick, who had mentioned my name to the show's research team when they were compiling a list of caterers in the region with unusual professional backgrounds. I said I would send her the business information she needed and that I was available for the production meeting the following week. The production meeting was at the Meridian Kitchen Collective, which was where the segment would film. Cora attended with a field producer named James Okafor, who was direct and efficient and spent most of the meeting walking the space and asking logistical questions. Marcus Vail was not at the meeting. He joined segments on shoot days, not pre-production calls, which Cora had explained in advance. James asked me what a typical production day looked like. I showed him the production schedule for a 40-person dinner I was preparing for the following Thursday. He photographed the schedule and said, "This is what we're here for." The shoot was scheduled for a morning 6 weeks out. I signed a participation agreement reviewed by a contracts attorney named Delia Sans, whose office was 3 blocks from the Meridian Kitchen Collective and who charged me $390 for the review and identified one clause about footage rights that she recommended I negotiate. I negotiated it. The production team accepted the revised language without discussion, which told me they had seen the request before. The shoot day was a Thursday. Marcus Vail arrived at 7:15. He was shorter than I expected, which is always the thing about television, and he was focused in a way that I found immediately workable. He asked questions about the production process with the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to understand the work rather than perform interest in it. We worked side by side for 4 hours. I made the base for a mushroom velouté, prepped the protein component for a 50-person dinner the following evening, and walked him through the cost modeling I used to price events at different scales. He said, at one point, watching me work through a margin calculation on the prep board, "You're the only caterer I've met who thinks about food the way a CFO thinks about a product line." I said, "I spent 7 years as a CPA. The food is different. The logic isn't." He wrote something in the small notebook he carried. The segment aired on a Friday evening in the spring, 11 days after it was recorded. It was 22 minutes of a 60-minute program. The frame was what Cora had described, the accounting background, the transition, the specific way financial discipline shaped how I ran a food operation. Marcus said on camera that Orem Catering was one of the most rigorously run small food businesses he had encountered in 4 seasons of the program. He said the mushroom velouté was the best thing he had eaten in 3 months of filming. I watched the segment from my apartment with Marco Delgado and Yolanda Fitch, who had both been at the shoot and who I had invited because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because I did not want to watch it alone. At the 10-minute mark, Marco made a sound that was not quite a word. At the 22-minute mark, when Marcus said the line about the most rigorously run small food business, Yolanda looked at me and said, "I'm going to need to renegotiate my rate." I said, "We'll talk Monday." My phone began moving at approximately 9:40 that evening, when the program's East Coast broadcast reached its largest viewership window. The messages came in the particular order that messages always come in after something like this. First the people who were already watching, then the people who saw it mentioned somewhere and went to find the stream, then the people who had been tagged by someone else and arrived late to the wave. Sandrovic sent a text at 9:47 that said, "I told them you were worth a segment. You were." Roberta Chin sent an email at 10:03 with a subject line that said, "Watch the whole thing twice." Theo Bassett sent a voice note from the Meridian Kitchen Collective, standing in what sounded like the parking lot, that was mostly ambient evening noise, and him saying, "There it is twice." The family group chat, which had been running at its standard low frequency of forwarded articles and logistical questions about holiday schedules, produced its first message about the segment at 10:19. It was from my cousin Danny, who had apparently been watching with Priya. He wrote, "Celeste. We just saw it." Then for 11 minutes the chat was still. Then my uncle Raymond, who was Vera's husband, sent a message that said, "We watched. Wonderful. Vera says well done." I read that message twice. The phrasing of it, "Vera says well done," delivered in the third person by her husband, which was the exact construction a person used when they had something to communicate but were not ready to be the one to say it, was a complete and sufficient answer to the question of where my aunt was in her process. I put my phone face down on the coffee table and went to make more coffee for Marco and Yolanda. My Aunt Vera called on a Sunday, which was 3 days after the segment aired. I had been waiting for the call with the particular patience of someone who has already decided how the conversation will go and is simply allowing time for it to arrive. She said, "I watched the program." I said, "I know." Raymond texted. A pause. She said, "You were very composed. You seemed completely at ease." I said, "I was in my kitchen. I'm always at ease there." Another pause. Longer. She said, "I want to apologize for what I said at Danny's wedding." I let the sentence complete and occupy its own space before I said anything. I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "I didn't understand what you had built. I understood what you had left, a stable career, a good salary, and I thought I understood what that meant. I didn't understand what you were building instead." I said, "Most people didn't." She said, "That's generous of you." I said, "It's accurate." She said, "I'd like to come to one of your events. As a guest. If you ever have something appropriate." I thought about the quarterly dinner I was preparing for Roberta Chin's organization in 6 weeks, 42 seats, a menu I had been developing for 3 months, the kind of event where the food was the entire point of the evening. I said, "There might be something in 6 weeks. I'll let you know." She said, "I'd like that." We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes. She asked about the program and about Marcus Vale, and about whether the segment had generated new business. I said it had. The inquiry volume in the 3 days since the broadcast had been higher than any prior 3-day period in the business's history, and I was in the process of assessing which inquiries matched the type of event I wanted to take on, and which I would decline or refer. She asked how I decided which to decline. I said, "The same way I decided everything. Does the work fit the capacity, and does the client understand what they're buying?" She said, "That sounds like something your grandmother would have said." I said, "I think it probably is." We said goodbye. I put the phone on the counter and stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked at the street below, which was doing what streets do on a Sunday in early spring, the unhurried particular version of continuing that belongs only to that day and that season. My mother called that afternoon, separately, which was how she called, separately, after things had already happened, when she had had time to think about what she wanted to say rather than what she felt immediately upon receiving information. She said, "Vera called me." I said, "I know." She said, "She was sorry. The real kind." I said, "I know that too." She said, "I should have said something at the wedding." I mouthed sorry, but that's not. She stopped. That's not the same thing. I said, you tried. She said, I should have done more than try. I said, yes. But I know why you didn't. She said, why? I said, because saying something would have made it bigger, and you thought containing it was the kinder thing to do. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that's exactly what I thought. I said, I know. You've always done that. Made things smaller to protect people. She said, does it bother you? I thought about that question honestly, about the wedding, and the mouthed sorry, and the years of watched conversations that my mother had smoothed over before they could become the thing they were about to become. I said, sometimes. Less than it used to. She said, I'm working on it. I said, I know. We talked for another 20 minutes about the segment, about the inquiries about Marco, about the 6-week dinner I had mentioned to Vera. I told her she was welcome too. She said she would come. I said good. I want to say something about the wedding and about my Aunt Vera, and about the specific quality of what she did, and why it is not simple. Vera is not a malicious person. She is a woman who spent her adult life in a professional environment where the vocabulary for risk was entirely negative, where leaving a stable position was a failure mode, where the distance between a salary and self-employment was the distance between security and exposure. She came from a family that had not had the luxury of treating financial stability as anything other than the primary objective. She had watched people make decisions that looked like freedom and become something else, and the pattern had calcified into a framework that was genuinely protective in the context that built it, and genuinely distorting in a different context. When she looked at me leaving a CPA position to run a catering business, she saw the risk and not the structure behind it. She saw what I was leaving and not what I was going toward. And she said what she said in the register she always used, the carrying voice, the volume calibrated to be heard, because she believed she was issuing a necessary warning, and she had never learned to distinguish between issuing a warning and making a public announcement. That is not a defense of what she did. It is an account of it, and the account is more useful than the defense. What I know is this: you cannot make the structure visible to someone who is looking at the risk. The structure becomes visible only when the thing is standing, and the thing becomes visible only when it is in a room that is hard to miss, a primetime segment, a full dining room, a name read out at an industry table. Until then, the work is its own company. You keep it, and it keeps you, and you let the visibility arrive when it arrives. The week after the segment aired, I had 23 new inquiries. I took 4 of them. The others were declined or referred to operations I trusted to handle the work correctly. The 4 I took were the 4 that fit, the right scale, the right brief, the right understanding of what they were asking for. Sandra Vick extended our retainer for a 2nd year, with revised terms that reflected the market rate adjustment that followed the visibility the segment had generated. The adjustment was modest and fair, and we completed the negotiation in one call. Roberta Chin booked 3 additional events for the year, including an anniversary gala for the organization that was the largest single event in Orem Catering's history to that point. 104 guests, a 5-course menu, a production week I planned with Marco, and a second prep assistant named Gina Tran, who I had hired in the 3rd month after the segment aired, and who had a background in hotel banquet production, and an eye for the kind of detail that only becomes visible when something goes slightly wrong. Theo Bassett expanded my dedicated kitchen hours at the Meridian Kitchen Collective by 4 mornings per week. He did not raise my rate. I raised it voluntarily, which he noted. Marcus Vale's production team reached out 7 months after the segment to ask whether I would be interested in a follow-up appearance in the next season. I said I was interested in the conversation. We had the conversation. The follow-up segment aired the following spring, in a slot 4 minutes longer than the first, in the program's most-watched episode of the season. My Aunt Vera attended the 6-week dinner at Roberta Chin's organization. She sat at a round table of 8, in the middle of the room, with a menu card in front of her and a glass of white wine she nursed through the first 2 courses. I was in the kitchen for all of it, and came out only at the end, briefly, to speak with Roberta and 2 board members who wanted to discuss the following year's event calendar. On the way out, my aunt found me near the door. She put one hand briefly on my arm. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, The food was extraordinary. I said, "Thank you, Vera." She said, "Your grandmother would have said the same thing." I said, "I know." She left. I went back to the kitchen. Marco was already breaking down the station, and Gina was in the middle of a container inventory, and the room smelled of the evening's last course, and the cleaning solution that meant the work was almost done. I put on an apron and started on the equipment. What I know now, that I did not know on the drive home from Danny's wedding, or knew differently, without the evidence that gives knowledge its full weight, is this. A prediction is only as good as the information behind it. My aunt's prediction was made from the information she had, which was what I was leaving and not what I was going toward. The information she was missing was not something I could have given her at the wedding reception. The information she was missing was the thing I had not yet built: the Sandrovic retainer, the Meridian mornings, the production schedules, the cost models, the quiet accumulation of events delivered on time and at the quality I had described. The 9-year education in my grandmother's kitchen that was the actual foundation of every plate that left my operation and arrived at someone's table and did what food is supposed to do. She needed to see the building. I needed to build it. Those two things could only happen in sequence, and the sequence had a duration, and the duration was the time between the wedding and the Friday evening when the segment aired. You cannot collapse the duration. You can only use it. That is the whole of what I know. That is the only thing I would tell you. If you were in a room, a wedding reception, a holiday table, a family gathering, when someone made a public prediction about something you were building, and you stayed quiet and let it land and went home and kept going, I want to ask you one question. On the morning after that evening, the first morning you went back to the work, not the morning of when the wound was still fresh, but the morning after, when the work was just the work again, what was the first thing you did? Because I think that first thing is the whole answer to everything they said. If this story found you today, share it with someone who has been given a timeline by someone who didn't understand what they were looking at. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. I'll see you in the comments.